Royal families have always lived under the bright glare of history's spotlight. Their births, marriages, and deaths were chronicled in painstaking detail, leaving little room for secrets. And yet, behind the gilded palace doors and marble halls, there existed stories deliberately hidden. Stories of children who never stood a chance. These were sons and daughters of kings and queens, born into privilege but stripped of recognition, affection, or even the right to live. Why? Because they were different. Some were born with conditions their families didn't understand, like Down syndrome, developmental disabilities, or severe physical deformities. Others were cast aside because they failed to fit the perfect image of strength and power that monarchies relied upon to survive. In an era when reputation was everything, a child who did not meet expectations could be seen as a curse, a weakness, or worse, an omen. Entire dynasties depended on heirs who could rule with authority, command respect, and lead armies into battle. But what happened when a royal child was born unable to fulfill these expectations? Too often, their stories ended in silence, confinement, or disappearance. Throughout Europe and beyond, whispers tell of infants hidden away in monasteries, locked in remote palaces, or never spoken of again. These children were erased not because of personal failings, but because their existence threatened the carefully curated image of perfection surrounding royal families. Their lives remind us of the cruelty that power, tradition, and image can impose, not just on nations, but on the most innocent within them. This story isn't about the great monarchs who reshaped history, nor the generals who led empires to glory. It's about those who never had the chance. It's about the forgotten children, royal sons and daughters whose lives were hidden, hushed, and erased from history. As we uncover their stories, we step into shadows of royal nurseries, behind the velvet curtains, where the cries of these children were heard only by a few and remembered by almost none. Monarchies were built on image. Kings and queens represented divine order, strength, and stability. To rule effectively, their families had to appear flawless, untouched by weakness. This expectation meant that every royal child carried the burden of being a living symbol. An heir was not simply a son or daughter. They were the embodiment of a dynasty's survival. But what if that heir, or even a younger child, was born different? In medieval and early modern Europe, physical deformities or mental disabilities were rarely understood. Without science to explain genetic conditions like Down syndrome, epilepsy, or autism, such differences were often labeled as curses, punishments from God, or evidence of sin. In royal families, where superstition ran deep, the birth of a child who did not fit the ideal could be seen as a direct threat to the monarchy's legitimacy. The consequences were grim. Records were destroyed, births were never announced, and sometimes a child was quietly relocated to a convent, monastery, or secluded estate. This way, the dynasty could maintain its polished image, while the child lived in obscurity or perished without a trace. The silence surrounding these children wasn't always driven by cruelty alone. In some cases, royal parents may have felt shame, helplessness, or genuine fear. A king might have worried that revealing such a child would embolden rivals to challenge his rule. A queen might have feared being blamed for bringing tainted blood into the royal line. The secrecy was as much about political survival as it was about image. But secrecy came at a devastating cost. These children lost not only their place in the family, but also their identities. Generations later, historians piecing together royal genealogies stumble across unexplained gaps, whispers of missing infants, and rumors of siblings no one was supposed to know about. The forgotten children remind us that monarchy wasn't just pageantry. It was theater, carefully staged to conceal flaws. Behind the gold and glitter, behind the portraits of perfect heirs, lay stories of pain, concealment, and exile. These stories set the stage for the individuals we'll meet. The hidden children of emperors, kings, and queens whose lives were deliberately erased from history. In the glittering courts of 19th century Europe, the House of Bavaria stood as one of the continent's most prominent dynasties. Yet among its grand palaces and lavish ceremonies, there was a daughter whose story barely made it into the official record. Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, born in 1826, is remembered today not for her royal titles or political influence, but for a peculiar shadow that hung over her existence. A shadow that reveals how royals dealt with children who did not conform to expectations. Alexandra was intelligent, soft-spoken, and deeply attached to her faith. But throughout her life, she displayed what contemporaries considered unusual behavior. Rumors circulated that she suffered from obsessive tendencies, strange beliefs, and severe anxieties. At one point, she reportedly became convinced she had swallowed a glass piano and lived in constant fear that it would shatter inside her if she moved incorrectly. To modern minds, this sounds like a manifestation of obsessive-compulsive disorder or schizophrenia. To her contemporaries, however, it was a scandal. The Bavarian court chose silence as its weapon. Unlike her siblings, who were married off into European dynasties or celebrated for her public roles, Alexandra was kept away from the spotlight. She never married and never ruled, and rarely appeared at major events. Official biographies of the family gloss over her existence, mentioning her only in passing, as though she were an afterthought. But Alexandra was not alone. Her life reflects a broader pattern. Royal families of Europe frequently concealed children who struggled with developmental, mental, or physical differences. In an age when monarchies clung to the illusion of perfection, admitting that a daughter of Bavaria feared breaking apart like fragile glass was unthinkable. So she was quietly confined, not in a prison cell, but in the social cage of invisibility. Alexandra lived until 1875, passing away at the relatively young age of 49. Her death drew little notice outside Bavaria, and within a generation, she was nearly forgotten. Yet her story survives in fragments, a reminder of how royal families chose silence over compassion. In her isolation, Alexandra symbolizes the countless royal children who never had the chance to live freely, not because of their own choices, but because their families fear how the world would perceive them. She was erased not from birth records, but from memory, consigned to the shadows of royal history. The Romanov dynasty of Russia is remembered for its grandeur, its brutal fall in 1917, and the tragic fate of Nicholas II's children. But even before the dynasty's bloody end, the Romanovs carried hidden burdens when it came to their offspring. While the world remembers the hemophilia of Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the throne, there were whispers of other children who suffered in silence. Alexei's condition was catastrophic for the dynasty. Born in 1904, he was the only son of Nicholas II and heir to the Russian throne. His hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder inherited from his mother's side, the British royal family, left him fragile, often bedridden, and at constant risk of death from minor injuries. To reveal his weakness would have been a disaster for the monarchy. Russia needed a strong, commanding heir, not a boy who could die from a bruise. The royal court adopted secrecy as its shield. Official statements spoke of Alexei's health in vague terms, masking the severity of his illness. Only a small circle knew the truth. The Tsar's son could barely walk without assistance at times, and even small injuries could spiral into near-fatal episodes. His suffering was hidden behind the palace gates, with doctors, servants, and even the infamous mystic Rasputin sworn to silence. But Alexei wasn't the only Romanov child whose life was shaped by concealment. Earlier branches of the dynasty also harbored secrets. In the 18th and 19th centuries, lesser-known Romanov children who were born with deformities or developmental challenges were quietly placed in remote estates, where they lived and died without fanfare. Their names rarely appear in official records, mentioned only in private letters or memoirs that surface long after. The Romanovs' desperation to project strength turned their children's vulnerabilities into state secrets. In Alexei's case, this silence helped destabilize the empire. As the boy's condition worsened, the family's reliance on Rasputin grew, fueling public suspicion and resentment. The secrecy meant that when revolution came, the Russian people felt betrayed by rulers who had hidden the truth. The Romanov story illustrates the danger of silence, not only for the children forced to live in shadows, but for entire nations. By erasing the frailty of their heirs, monarchies created illusions of invincibility that crumbled at the first real test. Alexei's tragedy and the whispered disappearances of other Romanov children reminds us that even the most powerful dynasties could not escape the vulnerability of human life. The British monarchy is among the best documented in the world. Yet even here, secrets linger in the shadows. Throughout history, royal children who failed to meet the crown's image of perfection were hidden away, their lives reduced to whispers. Two such figures were Prince John, the youngest son of King George V, and the less-remembered Prince Octavius, a son of King George III. Prince John was born in 1905, the youngest of 6 children of George V and Queen Mary. From an early age, it was clear that John was different. He suffered from epilepsy and, by many accounts, displayed traits of autism, though such a diagnosis did not exist at the time. Initially, John lived with his siblings at Sandringham, but as his seizures grew worse, the royal family began to shield him from public life. By 1916, at only 11 years old, John was moved permanently to Wood Farm, a secluded house on the royal estate. There, attended by nurses and occasionally visited by his mother, John lived out his short life in obscurity. He died in 1919 at the age of 13, following a severe epileptic seizure. His passing was quietly announced but received little public mourning. Newspapers described him as a delicate child and quickly moved on, while his siblings rarely spoke of him. For decades, John was treated as a footnote in royal history, his existence erased from public memory. Go back a century earlier, and the fate of Prince Octavius reveals the same pattern. Octavius was the 8th son of George III, born in 1779. By all accounts, he was a sweet and affectionate child. Yet his life was tragically short. In 1783, at just 4 years old, he was inoculated against smallpox, a standard practice of time, but soon fell ill and died. George III, devastated, confessed that Octavius had been his favorite child, but beyond the king's private grief, little attention was given to the boy's passing. What unites John and Octavius is the way their stories faded into obscurity. Despite being princes of Britain, their lives were reduced to footnotes, overshadowed by healthier, stronger heirs. In a monarchy obsessed with survival and continuity, children who did not fit the mold were quietly forgotten. Today, biographies and documentaries have begun to revisit Prince John's life, painting him not as a burden but as a child who deserved love and recognition. Yet for decades, both he and Octavius symbolized a silence that enveloped royal children deemed unfit for history. In the 19th century, Denmark's royal family projected an image of stability, warmth, and strong family ties. Queen Louise of Denmark, often called the mother-in-law of Europe because her children married into nearly every major European dynasty, was celebrated as a model matriarch. But beneath the polished surface of her family story lies a hidden chapter, one that speaks to how even beloved royals concealed children who didn't fit the expected mold. Historical whispers tell the son of Queen Louise and King Christian IX, who was born with severe developmental disabilities. Unlike his siblings, who became kings and queens across Europe, this boy was kept away from court life. While official records scarcely mention him, letters from contemporaries and rumors in diplomatic circles suggest his existence was quietly acknowledged but never publicly discussed. In an age when royal marriages were carefully orchestrated to strengthen alliances, the presence of a disabled child threatened the family's carefully curated image. For Queen Louise, who prided herself on her children's political triumphs, having a son who could never be married into another royal household represented not just personal grief, but a political inconvenience. Thus, he was reportedly sent to live in near total seclusion, attended only by caregivers, far from the glittering halls of Copenhagen. The tragedy of this story lies not only in the child's erasure, but in the contrast with his siblings' celebrated lives. While his sisters married into the royal families of Britain, Greece, and Russia, and his brothers ascended European thrones, he lived and died in silence. His name nearly lost to history. This pattern was not unique to Denmark. Throughout Europe, royal families faced the same dilemma. What to do when a child was born who could not fulfill dynastic expectations? The answer was nearly always the same: conceal, seclude, and erase. Although the details of Queen Louise's hidden son remain murky, the silence around him speaks volumes. His absence from official biographies reflects the calculated decision to preserve royal dignity at the expense of truth. It is a reminder that even families hailed as paragons of virtue chose secrecy over compassion when faced with imperfection. The boy's life, quiet, forgotten, erased, is emblematic of countless other royal children whose stories never made into history books. They were victims not of personal failings, but of dynastic pride. Spain's royal history is filled with intrigue, war, and scandal, but also with silences. The Spanish monarchy, particularly during the Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties, was plagued by inbreeding, which amplified genetic disorders and led to fragile heirs. While some of these tragedies were public, others were quietly concealed. Perhaps the most infamous example is King Charles II of Spain, known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. Born in 1661, Charles suffered from severe physical and mental disabilities caused by generations of inbreeding. He could barely speak until age 4, did not walk until age 8, and as an adult was sterile and frequently ill. Charles was a king, not a hidden child, but his existence reflects how vulnerable royal bloodlines were to genetic weaknesses. His reign was marked by instability, and his disabilities became a national crisis. But Charles was the exception in that he could not be hidden. Other royal children in Spain, particularly those born to junior branches of the dynasty, were quietly erased from history if they were born with conditions that disqualified them from dynastic roles. Records from the 18th and 19th centuries reference infants who died young, a phrase that often masked lives cut short not only by illness but by deliberate neglect or concealment. The Bourbons, who replaced the Habsburgs in the early 18th century, sought to restore strength to Spain's monarchy. For them, image was everything. An heir who displayed weakness could destabilize the dynasty, so fragile children were either quietly buried in official silence or dispatched to monasteries and convents. Letters between royal relatives hint at children unsuited for court who were sent away, never to return. The silence is particularly striking when compared to how Spain celebrated its perfect heirs. Portraits of strong princes and virtuous infantas filled palaces, while children who didn't fit this image simply vanished from collective memory. They existed, but in the shadows. Spain's silent tragedies remind us that the erasure of royal children was not an isolated practice, but part of a broader European pattern. Monarchy demanded perfection, and those who fell short were sacrificed, not in blood but in silence. French history is rich with royal spectacle. From the grandeur of Versailles to the tragedy of the guillotine, France's monarchs were masters of image-making. But behind the dazzling portraits and carefully staged appearances lay untold stories of children who did not fit the royal mold. The Bourbon dynasty in particular, ruling from the 16th to the 18th century, held its children to impossibly high standards. The Dauphin, or heir to the throne, was not simply a child but a symbol of France's future. Any weakness in an heir, be it physical deformity, developmental disability, or even frail health, was seen as a threat to the nation itself. Records from Versailles suggest that not every royal child thrived under this pressure. While healthy heirs were celebrated with lavish christenings and public ceremonies, others faded into obscurity. Some were officially recorded as having died in infancy, though whispers suggest that a few may have lived longer, hidden away in monastic institutions. Marie Antoinette, France's most infamous queen, gave birth to 4 children during her reign. While her daughter Marie-Therese survived the revolution, 2 of her other children died young, and her son Louis Charles the Dauphin became a victim of political cruelty. Imprisoned during the revolution, he suffered neglect and abuse, died at the age of 10. Though his case was political rather than medical, it highlights the vulnerability of royal children to forces far beyond their control. Earlier French dynasties also faced tragedies shrouded in silence. Medical records from the 17th century hint at children born with disabilities who were quietly removed from court life. To admit their existence would have tainted the dynasty's image of strength and divine favor. Thus, they were erased not only from history, but from memory itself. The French obsession with image ensured that the stories of such children remained hidden. Today, as historians revisit archives and private correspondence, fragments of these forgotten lives resurface. They remind us that behind the glittering facade of Versailles, there were shadows filled by children who never had the chance to shine. When royal families decided to erase children who did not meet expectations, they relied on a handful of strategies: exile, religious confinement, or quiet burial. Each method was a way of making the child disappear without sparking scandal. Exile often meant sending a child to a distant estate, cared for by trusted servants, far from the eyes of courtiers and the public. These estates became gilded cages, comfortable yet isolating. The child might live in relative luxury but was stripped of identity, purpose, and recognition. Confinement in convents or monasteries was another common fate, especially for daughters. A girl who could not marry into another dynasty due to disability or frailty was often given over to religious life, whether she wished it or not. To outsiders, it looked like piety. In reality, it was erasure. Within convent walls, these children vanished from history, remembered only in obscure church records. For infants and young children who died, or were said to die, quiet burials ensure their stories ended swiftly. In some cases, babies described as stillborn may actually have lived for days or weeks before succumbing to neglect or being hidden from public knowledge. Without modern record-keeping, their existence could be erased almost entirely. These strategies reveal the lengths monarchies went to in order to maintain perfection. They did not simply hide flaws. They institutionalized the erasure of their own children. The cost was profound, not only for the children themselves, but for history, which lost voices that might have told us much about humanity within royalty. The stories of Europe's forgotten royal children are haunting, not because of what they did, but because of what was done to them. Born into privilege, they should have had lives filled with comfort and opportunity. Instead, many were hidden, silenced, or erased, victims of dynastic pride and the relentless demand for perfection. From Bavaria's fragile Alexandra to Britain's secluded Prince John, from Russia's suffering Tsarevich Alexei to Spain's silent tragedies, their stories echo across centuries. Though their names are often missing from official histories, their lives mattered. They remind us that monarchy, for all its pageantry, was built on illusions that came at a human cost. Today, as historians uncover fragments of these lives, we are given a chance to restore their humanity. By remembering them, we honor children who were denied recognition in their own time. Their existence forces us to question the values of societies that prize image over compassion, and to acknowledge the silent suffering hidden behind palace walls. The next time we marvel at royal portraits, gleaming crowns, or tales of kings and queens, we must also remember the shadows in the nurseries, the children who were erased from history. For in telling their stories, we give them back the dignity that was stolen. They were royal, they were children, and they were forgotten. Until now, if you found this story haunting, don't let it vanish into silence like the children history tried to erase. Subscribe to the Crit Stories for more untold tales hidden in the shadows of history. And remember, sometimes the darkest secrets are found behind the brightest crowns.